Hello friends, paper historian here. I'm glad to welcome you to my channel, where we don't just tell stories, we ride inside them, with dust in our teeth and arrows hissing past our ears. Tonight's tale begins not in a palace or a temple, but in the endless steppe, where the sky is your only ceiling and hunger is your closest companion. You'll hear it in the first person, the voice of Temujin, the boy who once wore a wooden yoke like a dog, who lost his father, his tribe, his dignity, and swore that the steppe itself would one day speak his name. He would grow into Chingis Khan, breaker of dynasties, maker of law, and shadow on half the world. So saddle up, tighten your grip, and ride with him, because the storm is about to begin. I was not born beneath a painted ceiling or behind stone walls. I came into the world under the felt of a jeer and the open jaw of the steppe, where wind is a language and horses breathe like bellows in the night. The old ones say, lightning crawled along the horizon the hour I cried, and the shaman, his drum thudding like hooves, mumbled that such a child would live with the sky's fire in his fist. My mother said I clutched a clot of blood when they washed me, an omen, hard and red, that the road ahead would be cut from iron and meat. They named me Temujin after an enemy my father had taken in battle. That was my first inheritance, to wear a stranger's name and feel the weight of another man's defeat in my mouth before I could suck milk. My father, Yesuge, was called Bartar, hero, but that word is only the frost the steppe lays over other words. Raider, taker, giver, breaker. He was ahead of our small fire in the Kiyad lineage, brave in the saddle, braver when necessary on the ground, a man who laughed with his teeth and made men laugh with him. He brought my mother, Herlun, into our ger, not with gifts and oaths, but by stealing her from another man's wagon. And still she built our home with a spine like a spear shaft, her hands tough as rawhide and her eyes that never begged. Not from hunger, not from winter, not from anyone. I remember the smell of mare's milk before I remember words, the hot leather of a sweating pony more clearly than I remember any lullaby. We moved with the seasons the way birds move in the sky, following grass, following water, following the old paths men forget until their horses remember. Childhood was 1,000 small lessons. How to read the wind's teeth, how to tie a knot that would not shame you when a storm pulled at it, how to keep silent when elders spoke, and how to speak like a blade when your turn finally came. We played at war with sticks, struck stones from the frozen ground, and called them enemies' skulls, and none of us knew how short the distance truly is between play and hunger, between a boy and a wolf. When I had seen 9 winters, my father took me to seek a wife, as was proper, and as fate would have it, ruinous. We rode east under a sky like hammered iron and came upon Tatars who smiled with their mouths and kept knives behind their teeth. They offered fermented mare's milk as courtesy, and memory offered poison. We drank because to refuse is to be small, and the steppe devours the small. The poison took my father quickly, but not gently. I remember his face turning the colour of cold ash, his hands shaking on the reins, his breath going thin like the last smoke of a spent fire. We reached our people with him half alive, and I sat with him as he looked past me and spoke to the felt above, telling me to be hard, to lead, to hold men together as he had held our camp against wind and envy. Then he stopped speaking forever. If you have never watched a flock when the lead ram falls, you cannot understand what happened next. The men who had eaten at our hearth scattered like crows startled by a dog. Those who had called my father brother discovered they were cousins of our enemies after all. Within days, our line was a thread snapping in the wind. Herlun gathered us, me, my brothers, my sister, around a fire that had no meat to warm, and told us we would not die while her hands could still grip a knife. We learned the taste of roots and river fish beaten senseless under the ice. We learned how to steal from traps we could not set ourselves, and how to sleep without roofs when the wolves' voices stitched the night together. Hunger is a teacher and a judge. It wastes no words, and it leaves scars the eye cannot see. Worse than hunger was the laughter. It is a strange thing to be the son of a Batar and yet be marked as easy prey. The boys of the Taichi Ut taught me that lesson with fists, with stones, with a wooden kangui they hammered around my neck like a yoke. The wood bit my skin and made the air a small, stubborn thing I had to bargain with, and each step I took was a reminder that I had nothing that was mine. Not breath, not bread, not name. I carried that kangu through their camp like a goat and learned how quickly men forget their oaths when the wind changes. I remember escape like I remember cold water, all shock and then all clarity. Night, the river black and muttering under a skin of ice, the dogs' voices ripping holes in the dark behind me. I slid into the water to soften the wood, to silence the clatter of my prison. I crawled along roots as if the trees were my mother and I their lost child. I waited for the night to look away. A man, Sokon Shira, found me there, my lips blue and my eyes too full of hate for a child's face. He hid me among bales, he split the kanji, he sent me into the dark with nothing but the word go, and the knowledge that mercy is a kind of power too, one I would owe and repay in the coin of years. I learned then that freedom is not given. You must gnaw it from the bone, you must steal it, bite it, wrest it from hands that will not open for you. I told myself that the next cage I wore would be one I put on other men. We did not die. That is the dull miracle of those years. Hoelin kept us alive by never allowing us to believe we deserved otherwise. Kassar, quick and fierce, would laugh with blood on his lip and a fish thrashing in his hands. Belguti, Belgutai, the solid one, could break a man's temper with a look. Kachikun sulked and planned. My youngest, Timuga, watched with the quiet patience of a winter-bent reed. We stole when we had to, worked when we could, and learned to count friend and enemy by their eyes, not their words. The steppe respects those who respect themselves. Even wolves will leave a she-wolf's cubs if they see her teeth. My father had said, men are ropes, if you do not twist them together, they snap. I twisted what was left of us into a cord. My brothers, a few old men who remembered Yesugei's fire as more than warmth. A handful of boys who smelled more of hunger than loyalty. I learned the art of giving to receive later, returning a stolen daughter to her father, sending a horse in place of an apology, finding a lost foal and placing it in a man's arms as if I had pulled it from the belly of the earth. I learned to call men by their deeds instead of their mothers' names, to use old bitterness as tinder rather than as a blanket. A stepplord is not the loudest voice at the fire. He is the hand that empties the pot last. Do not think I forgot the Taichi Ut. I kept their names like stones in my coat for warmth and for weight. When I was strong enough to stand without swaying in the wind, when our ger no longer leaked smoke and sorrow, I went back for those stones and laid them on the table one by one. Not yet in blood. Blood spills too quickly and dries too fast. But in small victories that made their laughter choke. A trap sprung empty, a horse gone and found in my herd. A messenger who left and did not arrive. Their boys learned to look over their shoulders when they went to piss. I learned to be patient the way ice is patient with rock. It was near a winter fire, while fish fat burned black on the rim of the pot and my brothers snored like tired dogs, that I set my vow aloud. I had carried it inside me so long, the words felt like old friends. I would gather men until my name was a road they wanted to walk. I would make the steppe speak with one voice when it spoke to me. I would bend those who had bent us, and I would be remembered as more than a boy with a wooden yoke around his neck. The stars make no promises, but they listened. The wind that night did not laugh. From then on, every dawn was a cut into that vow, every dusk another knot tied. I rose before light, when horse breath still smoked like ghosts around the tethering posts, and I practiced holding silence in my mouth until it tasted sweet. I practiced speaking so that men felt stronger standing near me. I practiced the work no one sees, checking girths, mending straps, standing last at the pot and first at the rope. Power, I learned, is a habit first and a shout only when it must be. If you ask me where my childhood ended, I will not point to my father's death, though it broke us, or to the night I ran with a kangaroo, though it marked me. It ended the morning I realized I no longer looked at the horizon as a line drawn by someone else's hand. The steppe was not a wall, it was a road without end. I told Herlun I would be gone at first light with Karsar and Belgute to find horses worth stealing and men worth trusting. She looked at me as if she could see, for a heartbeat, the man inside the boy, and she did not bless me. Blessings are for those who need excuses. She only said, "Bring back something that makes the pot heavier." I did not bring back a horse that night. I brought back a man, thin, hard-eyed, with a scar like a broken river down his cheek, who had as much to hate as I did and as little to lose. His name was not important. What mattered was that when we ate, he passed the meat to Herlun before he took his own, and when the dog snapped, he did not flinch. 1 becomes 2, 2 become 5, and somewhere in that small arithmetic I felt the step tilt. Not enough to make a man fall, enough to make a boy smile with his teeth. I had been a captive and a beggar. I had been the son of a Bartar and the mouth of an empty pot. I knew already that the step tests men by taking from them, not by giving. I had something the step could not take any longer, a name I had decided to own, Temujin. The syllables no longer tasted of an enemy my father had crushed. They tasted of the road I would cut with the edge I had been sharpening in silence. If the gods wanted to laugh, they could, but if they wanted to test me, they would learn what I had learned in hunger. A man does not break when he is used to breaking and mending himself every day. So I put my hand on the withers of the horse that would carry me out of boyhood, and I told my brothers the simple truth. We go. The steppe said nothing back, because it had already said everything. We survived, but survival was not life. It was chewing roots until my gums bled. It was scooping fish from under the ice with bare hands until my fingers split. It was listening to my mother divide scraps of meat as if she were portioning out eternity itself. Hunger is not a visitor in the steppe. It is the neighbor who sits with you at every fire, breathing down your neck, reminding you that you are small, reminding you that the wolves are hungrier still. I carried hunger in my belly like another organ, always growling, always gnawing. But worse than hunger was humiliation. Once my father had been a chief, a Bartar, a man others followed. After his death, we were beggars. The Taichiut boys mocked me, threw stones, tied a kangaroo around my neck like I was a dog. I remember stumbling in that wooden yoke, the weight digging into my collarbones, the laughter burning hotter than the sun. A boy with a kangaroo is not a boy. He is a reminder to everyone else of what happens when strength leaks away. And every time they jeered, every time my stomach cried, I swallowed my fury whole and let it sit like a hot stone in my chest. Someday, I told myself, someday the stone will roll back down on them. I learned early that family in the steppe is both shield and knife. My half-brother Beshta grew bigger, stronger, and greedier. When meat was scarce, he took more. When horses were weak, he claimed the best. We all felt the strain, my full brothers and I, and one day the knot snapped. We confronted him by the river, 4 hungry boys circling like wolves around a wolf that had turned against its own. He sneered, daring us. I drew the bow. The arrow sank into his flesh, and Bector fell with surprise in his eyes, as if he had forgotten that hunger makes brothers into enemies. We shared his meat because we had to prove we were not boys but men who would not be denied food or power. The whispers carried fast. Temujin killed his brother. Some said I was ruthless, others said I was destined. My mother grieved, but she did not cast me out. She knew, as I did, that mercy is a luxury for the fed. For the hungry, every act is judgment. That day I learned the truth. Blood ties are nothing without strength to hold them. The only family that matters is the one that can stand against the wind. But I could not rely only on brothers. I needed allies. The steppe does not forgive loneliness. So I began to gather those who had been cast aside, the poor, the broken, the ones robbed by stronger clans. I offered not wealth, I had none, but loyalty. I promised that my word would hold even if my hands were empty. One winter we returned a kidnapped boy to his father, and the man spread the tale. Temujin keeps his word. That story was more valuable than horses, more valuable than gold. A reputation is a blade sharper than any iron. Slowly the scraps of men became a band. We were still small, still weak, but we were not nothing. And with them I tasted my first real victory. The Taichi drove a small herd across the plain, fat horses snorting in the cold air, and we struck like lightning. We were fewer, but hunger had hardened us. Our arrows found flesh, our blades found fear. The herd scattered, and when the dust cleared, we drove part of it back to our camp. That night, we ate meat until the grease shone on our faces, and the fire's crackle was drowned by our laughter. I told them, "This is only the beginning," and they believed me. But victories are like sparks in dry grass. They draw eyes quickly. The more we succeeded, the more the Taichi turned their gaze on me. They whispered my name with anger now, not laughter. Once, that would have frightened me. Now it sharpened me. To be noticed is to matter. To be hunted is to prove you are dangerous. The steppe was teaching me its lesson over and over. Mercy is weakness, weakness is death. If you want to live, you must become sharper than hunger, harder than humiliation, colder than the river at night. I was no longer a child begging scraps. I was Temujin, the boy who killed his brother, the boy who gathered the broken, the boy who struck the Taichi and lived. I still had little, but I had the beginning of power, and the vow inside me pulsed with each heartbeat. One day I will gather men until the steppe itself bends. One day those who laughed will crawl. One day my name will be iron. I looked at my hands often in those years, thin, scarred, cracked from cold and labour. They looked weak, but I knew their truth. These hands had killed, these hands had fed, these hands had kept a promise. One day they would hold the reins of the whole steppe. When you are young in the steppe, alliances are forged not only by blood, but by marriage. And I knew that if I was to rise from the ashes of my father's broken clan, I needed more than brothers and scraps of horses. I needed a partner who would anchor me and bind me to another line. So I returned to the family of my childhood betrothed, Berta. Her people, the Ongirat, were not mighty, but they were stable, a river that still flowed while so many others dried. I remember the day we were wed. There was no palace, no ceremony carved into stone, only felt walls, fire, the smell of mutton fat rising from the pot, the neighing of horses outside. Berta wore a black coat of sable, the kind that gleamed like night itself. She was calm, steady, her gaze direct in a way that unsettled even me. She was not fragile. She was the kind of woman who knew the weight of Aegea's roof pole, who could tether horses, who could command servants. In her eyes I saw not just beauty, but strength, and strength was what I hungered for more than meat. Our union bound me to the Ongirat, gave me allies, gave me legitimacy. For a brief moment I felt the ground firm beneath my feet, as though my vow to gather men and power was finally taking root. We shared nights, laughter, the beginnings of trust. Berta was not merely wife, she was the echo of my vow, the proof that Temujin could build, not just destroy. But the steppe does not allow peace to ripen. The Merkits had not forgotten the insult of years past, when my father stole Hoelun, my mother, from one of their camps. In the steppe, memory is long, and revenge is patient. They came one night like wolves, fast and merciless. Our camp was small, our guards few. I woke to shouts, the clash of blades, the cries of horses cut from their tethers. We fought, but we were outnumbered. I remember Berta's face as they seized her, her voice calling my name as she was dragged into the night. The fire's glow lit her sable coat as she vanished into the dark, and in that instant I felt my blood turn to iron. I was humiliated, broken, but not defeated. A man who cannot protect his wife is nothing in the steppe, but a man who refuses to retrieve her is worse than nothing. I gathered what men I had, but we were too few, so I swallowed pride and sought aid. I turned to Togrul, the Khan of the Keriet, who had once been ally of my father. I called him Anda, sworn friend, though the steppe teaches that even friendship is only as deep as usefulness. He listened, he weighed, and at last he gave me warriors. I also called on Jarmuka, my blood brother by oath, though his loyalty was always the shifting kind, like sand in wind. Together, for a moment, we were bound by purpose. The Merkits had to bleed. We rode with fury, 100 strong, a tide of hooves thundering across the plain. When we reached the Merkit camp, dawn was breaking and our arrows fell like rain. The surprise was ours, and revenge is a fire that does not wait. We cut through their lines, scattered their herds, seized their women and children as they had seized ours. In the chaos, I found Berta, alive, trembling but unbroken. When I lifted her onto my saddle, when I felt her weight behind me as we rode from the smoking ruins, I knew that Temujin was no longer just a boy clutching hunger in his belly. I was a man who could lose and take back, a man who could summon allies, a man who could command. But victories are never free. Berta was pregnant when I brought her back, and whispers ran like foxes through the grass. Whose child was it? Mine, or the Merkits? In the steppe, doubt is as deadly as arrows. I silenced whispers with steel where I had to, with generosity where I could. I raised the boy, Yochi, as my own, but the question never left men's lips. That seed of doubt would one day grow into quarrels even among my sons. Yet Berta's dignity never wavered. She stood beside me, proud, unashamed, her voice calm, her presence steady, and in her I found the strength to ignore gossip and focus on building the storm I promised myself long ago. That campaign changed me. Until then, I had been scavenger, survivor, wolf cub, gnawing bones in shadows. After Beata's abduction and return, I was predator. I had tasted the power of alliances, the strength of calling men to my banner. I learned that vengeance, when planned and swift, could bend fate itself. And most of all, I learned that Temujin's name could echo not in laughter, but in fear. As we rode back from the Merkit lands, the smoke still trailing behind us, I looked at the men around me, my brothers, the Keret riders, Jamuka's warriors, and I saw not just allies, but the beginning of something larger. For the first time, I felt what it was to command not just a family, not just a handful of desperate friends, but an army. The steppe itself seemed to shiver under our hooves, as if acknowledging that Temujin was no longer a boy dragged in a wooden kanji. I was a man with a wife reclaimed, a vengeance fulfilled, a band of warriors swelling, and the steppe, though vast, would no longer be enough to contain me. The night we rode against the Merkits, Jamuka was my brother in oath, my Anda. We shared the same saddle blanket, the same fire, the same taste of victory. But oaths in the steppe are like arrows loosed in wind, true only until the wind changes. I knew this, even then. Still, I needed him. His following was strong, his banners many, and together we cut into the Merkits like a hawk into rabbits. For a moment, it seemed we could be two wings of the same storm. But Jamuka loved glory more than unity. Where I gave meat to the poor, he gave it to nobles. Where I rewarded loyalty, he rewarded bloodline. I wanted men to follow me because I kept my word. He wanted men to follow because his ancestors had ruled before. These differences, small at first, grew sharper with every victory. After Berta was returned, the fires of revenge still glowing, I felt the pull of my own path. I gathered men who cared little for noble lineage, men who wanted justice, men who wanted meat in their bowls and protection for their families. They saw in me not a lord of ancestry, but a leader of deeds. Slowly my camp grew, first 20 families, then 40, then more. Jamuka watched, and I could see in his eyes the same envy the Taichi Ute boys once showed me when they tightened the kangwe around my neck. The steppe has no patience for two suns in the sky. Whispers reached me. Jamuka resented me. Jamuka spoke of me with contempt. Jamuka's men muttered that Temujin was only a servant's son pretending at Khan. I let the whispers grow because I knew whispers are rope. They choke their owners in time. Still, I prepared. The Taichi Ute had mocked me since childhood, their laughter sharper than blades. They had left my family to starve after my father's death. They had yoked me like a beast. They were still out there, strong, contemptuous, a thorn that festered every time I breathed. I swore to myself that one day I would grind their name into dust. But to face them, I needed more than brothers. I needed a nation. So I called men by word, not blood. I told them, I will not care if your father was Khan or shepherd. If you ride with me, if you fight for me, you are my kin. And they came. Outcasts, broken families, warriors sick of Jamuka's arrogance, young men with no inheritance. They tied their fate to mine, and in that moment I felt the step shift. I was not yet Khan, but I was more than a beggar. Jamuka struck first. We clashed near Darlan Baljut. His army was larger, but my men fought with the hunger of wolves. The ground was churned with hooves, arrows fell like hail, the air thick with screams. We broke some of his lines, but Jamuchi had numbers. He crushed us. 70 men of mine were captured. He executed them with cruelty, boiling them alive, leaving their bodies as warnings. That day, I learned not only the cost of betrayal, but also the weight of revenge that grows heavier than iron. I swore I would repay Jamuka's cruelty with fire until his name was forgotten. But even in defeat, seeds grow. The men who survived saw my resolve, saw that I did not abandon them, saw that I returned to fight again and again. Slowly, families still came to me because they understood. Jamuka was cruel, Temujin was just. He could burn, but I would protect. And protection in the steppe was worth more than lineage. We struck again, not with numbers, but with cunning. Raids, ambushes, alliances made in smoke and sealed with mare's milk. We began to beat the Taichi Ute in small battles. We seized horses, women, herds. Each victory added to my camp. Each man who joined brought 2 more. I rewarded merit. If a man fought well, he ate first, no matter if he was born slave. If he kept his word, I kept mine. Word became iron. Slowly, I built something the steppe had never seen. Loyalty that was not tied to kinship alone. Men followed because they trusted. And in trust, I saw the beginnings of power that could last. Jamuka still prowled, still gathered banners, still declared himself Khan. But his arrogance was his own poison. Nobles whispered against him. Allies drifted to me. The more he demanded obedience by birth, the more men looked to me for justice by deed. The steppe was choosing, slowly, painfully. I remember one night after a raid on the Taichi Ute. The fire crackled, meat roasted, my men laughed, their faces lit by smoke and victory. Berta sat nearby, silent but steady, her presence the pole that held my G upright. I looked around and realized this was no longer a band of outcasts. This was a tribe, my tribe. And I swore again, louder than before. I will not stop until all the clans bow together, until there is one law, one banner, one name, my name, Temujin. The steppe laughed, as it always does. but the wind carried my words farther than I imagined, and in time, even the laughter turned to silence. Defeat carves men deeper than victory ever does. After Jarmuka boiled my men alive, I carried their screams in my chest like coals that would not cool. Every time the wind shifted, I heard them again, and I swore I would build a world where loyalty was not punished by cruelty, where men who followed would not be discarded like scraps. That oath became the spine of my rise. The steppe had always been a chaos of clans, each proud of bloodline, each quick to betray, each living by old grievances. I understood that to rule such a place required more than ancestry, more than noble names shouted across fires. It required something new, a law that cut through kinship and reached straight to the bone of trust, so I began to reshape my camp. I said, merit over lineage. If you fight well, you eat well. If you keep your word, I keep mine. It was simple, but simplicity is sharper than ritual. Men who had been slaves in one camp became captains in mine. A poor man could rise above a noble if his deeds proved him. Families that had been spat on by aristocrats found a seat at my fire. Slowly, men began to whisper, Temujin is just. Temujin does not forget. Temujin rewards. And with whispers came banners. Families defected from Chamucha, from the Taichi Ut, from lesser tribes bringing herds, weapons, wives. Each one I welcomed, not as vassals, not as servants, but as brothers in a larger family. I divided them into units, tens, hundreds, thousands, not by clan, but by loyalty. A man from one tribe would serve beside a man from another, eating together, fighting together, owing allegiance only to me. It broke old kinship lines, but it forged something new. An army, a people, bound not by blood, but by law. That law we called Yasa. At first it was only my word, but my word was iron, and so men obeyed. No stealing from your own camp, no lying in council. Share the spoils, keep discipline, respect the chain of command. It was harsh, but the step was harsher. Men realized quickly that order brought strength, and strength brought survival. I punished betrayal ruthlessly, but I rewarded loyalty even more fiercely. Soon, my yasa was repeated around fires far beyond my own, and my name travelled with it. The more clans joined me, the heavier the weight grew. To command brothers is easy. To command thousands requires iron in your tongue and patience in your gut. I held councils, listened to grievances, made judgments. I gave justice to the weak, even against the strong. Word spread, Temujin's camp is safe. That was all I needed. Safety in the steppe was more precious than gold. The moment of truth came when we confronted Jarmuka again. He had declared himself Gurkhan, universal ruler, but his cruelty had soured many. When our forces met, my banners stretched across the plain, organized, disciplined, hungry. His men fought, but many fled, their loyalty already broken. Chamuka was defeated. He fled with a handful of followers, and the rest bent knee. I spared many, even some who had once mocked me, because mercy, when measured, wins more followers than slaughter. Jarmuka himself was eventually betrayed by his own men and brought to me. I did not torture him. I did not boil him alive. I gave him a noble's death, quick, clean. Even in ending, I proved I was not him. That choice became legend, and legends bind tighter than fear. After that, the road to khanship opened. One by one, clans swore allegiance. The Karaite, the Naiman, the smaller tribes. Some came willingly, others after battle, but all came. At a great council by the Onon River, banners from across the steppe rose into the sky. Men gathered by the thousands, their horses stamping, their women and children watching. There, they raised me on a felt carpet, lifted by the hands of my generals, and proclaimed me Chingis Khan, universal ruler of the Mongols. I remember the sound most of all, the thunder of voices shouting my new name, the neighing of horses, the pounding of hooves. The wind itself seemed to pause, listening. I was no longer Temujin, the boy with a kanji, the hungry orphan, the man mocked by clans. I was Chingis Khan, and the steppe had given me its full breath. But Khanship is not crown or jewel, it is burden. To hold the steppe is to hold a wolf by the throat. You must never let go, never relax, never sleep too deeply. I looked around at the faces of my generals, Kasar, Jelmi, Subutai, men forged from my vow, and I knew this was only the beginning. The clans were united, yes, but beyond the horizon there were empires fat and soft, ripe for conquest, and if I did not ride against them, the steppe itself would turn against me. Still, that night I allowed myself one breath of satisfaction. I had taken the laughter of my enemies, the betrayal of my kin, the hunger of my youth, and I had hammered them into a crown of iron. I had been raised not by birth, but by vow, not by noble blood, but by fire and loyalty. And now the world would hear the name Chingis Khan, and it would not be a whisper, it would be a storm. To unite the steppe was victory, but to keep it was obligation. Men who had once been enemies now sat at my fire, and men who sat at my fire hungered for more than pasture. To keep warriors loyal, you must give them war. To keep their herds fat, you must give them plunder. I knew that if I stopped riding, my own men would turn inward, gnawing like wolves trapped in the same pit. So I turned their eyes outward. Beyond our borders were empires swollen with riches, walls, cities, silk. All the things the steppe mocked but secretly desired. The first test was Shisha, the Tangut kingdom. They had strong walls, desert fortresses, and armies that marched in order. They thought their walls were mountains, their rivers moats wide enough to drown us. I knew better. Walls are cages when your enemy does not fight like you. My men could ride where no armies marched, circle where no maps extended, strike where supply lines frayed. We harried their caravans, took their horses, burned their outposts. I remember the first city we besieged. My men laughed at the walls, so tall, so proud. A wall, I told them, is only a trap if the enemy has the courage to come out. And so we forced them to. We cut off supplies, poisoned streams, sent arrows by the thousands to rain down on their roofs. When they sallied, we cut them apart in the dust. When the gates finally opened, we stormed in like floodwater. My men took loot, women, grain. I took submission. Shisha bowed, gave tribute, offered daughters in marriage. They thought tribute would tame me. Tribute only whets the hunger of wolves. But the true prize lay farther east, the Jin Empire, rulers of northern China. They were rich, arrogant, and had long demanded that steppe chieftains bow and bring tribute. I was no chieftain, I was Khan, and I would not bow. The Jin thought themselves unassailable. They had cities of stone, armies in the hundreds of thousands, weapons forged with iron far better than our rough smiths could manage. They believed the Mongols were nothing but scattered horsemen, fit to raid caravans, not to break dynasties. They were wrong. I sent scouts deep, gathering every path, every weakness. My generals rode ahead, Subutai and Jabi, the eagle-eyed and the arrow-handed. They mapped rivers, found mountain passes, turned the vastness of China into a battlefield as familiar to us as the steppe. We rode light, carried little, lived off plunder. The Jin carried wagons of supplies, slow, clumsy, fat for the killing. At first we struck their border towns. My men learned the taste of rice, the weight of silks, the gleam of porcelain. They began to see that beyond the steppe lay a world of wealth. And their loyalty hardened, because a Khan who brings not only meat but treasure is a Khan worth dying for. The Jin Emperor underestimated us. He sent generals to crush us, armies vast as locust swarms. We broke them by refusing to fight their way. We circled, feigned retreat, drew them into traps. We split their forces, struck their rear, cut their supplies. My horsemen could ride for days without fire, without tents, surviving where pampered soldiers could not. When the Jin thought we were fleeing, we were stalking. When they thought we were scattered, we were waiting. At the battle near Zhongdu, their capital, the earth shook with hooves. Their arrows darkened the sky, but ours fell faster, lighter, more precise. We flanked, surrounded, bled them dry. I watched the golden banners of the Jin waver, fall, trampled into dust. Cities fell one by one, gates splintered, towers burned. My men swarmed walls with ladders, tore tiles from roofs, dragged defenders screaming into alleys. The Jin emperor fled, leaving his capital to burn. My men looted Zhongdu until even their horses staggered beneath the weight of silk and silver. But I did not destroy the Jin completely, not yet. Sometimes it is wiser to leave an enemy alive, to keep tribute flowing, to let fear grow in the marrow of those who think themselves safe. These campaigns tested more than armies. They tested me. Could I command not only my kin, not only scattered clans, but tens of thousands, a nation of warriors bound only by my word? The answer came in victory. My yasa held. Discipline kept the horde from devouring itself even as it devoured kingdoms. The steppe was no longer my only pasture. China itself bent under my hooves. But I did not forget the vow of my youth. These victories were not just for loot, they were for memory, for the boy who once wore a wooden kangui, for the family left to starve, for the 70 boiled alive by Jamuka. Every city that fell, every tribute offered, every emperor who bowed was another stone laid on the cairn of my revenge. Yet even as we triumphed, I knew this was only the beginning. To the west lay Khwarezm, arrogant and rich. To the south lay more dynasties, more walls to tear down. I was Chingis Khan, and now that I had broken Shisha and humbled the Jin, the horizon itself seemed too small. When word first reached me of Khwarezm, it came not as a challenge of war, but as a promise of trade. My empire stretched from the forests of the north to the deserts of the south, from the walls of Zhongdu to the mountains of Altai, and I hungered not only for conquest, but for routes, markets, tribute that flowed without blood. I thought perhaps the Shah of Khwarezm would see wisdom in friendship. He ruled a kingdom rich in cities, in scholars, in merchants who carried silk and spices across deserts. I sent envoys, men bearing gifts, silks, golden bowls, falcons. I offered alliance. The Shah smiled in words, but his heart was swollen with arrogance. He did not see me as Chingis Khan, master of the steppe, breaker of dynasties. He saw only a barbarian in felt, a raider with too many horses. He accepted my gifts, but in his eyes they were tribute, not partnership. He believed that behind my armies there was only emptiness, no roots, no stone cities, no glory worth fearing. Pride is a blade sharper than any sword, and it cut him deeply enough that he could not see the trap closing around him. I sent the caravan to Ultra, a city of his realm, heavy with goods, merchants eager to prove that Mongols could trade as well as conquer. The governor seized them, killed them, claiming they were spies. My heart burned, but still I restrained my hand. I sent 3 envoys directly to the Shah, demanding justice, demanding the punishment of Ultra's governor. The Shah murdered one, shaved the beards of the others, and sent them back in chains. In the steppe, to insult an envoy is to insult the heavens themselves. He had spat in my face. There is no law left after such an insult, only fire. I gathered my generals, Subotai, Yebi, men whose cunning had already broken nations. We rode west, not as a caravan, but as a storm. 200,000 men, herds of horses that shook the earth, engineers who had learned from Chinese sieges, discipline forged in my yasa. We crossed deserts where lesser armies would have starved. My scouts mapped every oasis. My horsemen carried dried meat and milk. The Shah thought the sands would swallow us. Instead, the sands became our cloak. Otra was first. The city tried to resist, its walls high, its people proud. We encircled it, cut its supply, built engines of war. My men hurled stones, fire, corpses to rot inside their streets. Months passed, but patience is a weapon too. At last the gates fell. The governor who murdered my merchants I executed with molten silver poured into his eyes and throat. Let him drink wealth until it choked him. Then we moved on, city by city. Bukhara, Samarkand, Ujjain, names that scholars recited like jewels, names that glowed with mosques and markets, names that thought themselves eternal. I stood before Bukhara's mosque, thousands of citizens trembling, and I told them, I am the flail of God. If you had not committed great sins, he would not have sent a punishment like me upon you. They bent their heads. My men took the city. Samarkand fell next, though its defenders numbered in tens of thousands. My horsemen encircled them, feigned retreat, drew them out, then slaughtered them in dust. The gates opened soon after. The artisans we spared, sending them east to serve my empire, the soldiers we executed. I would not leave weapons in the hands of men who broke oaths. Urgent was harder. The city clung stubbornly, its streets narrow, its defenders fierce. The battle lasted weeks, blood-soaking alleys, corpses piled high. In the end we flooded parts of the city, drowning defenders. Those who remained alive were executed. Some chroniclers say 100,000 died. I do not know the number. I know only that the Amu Darya carried their bodies away like logs after a flood. The Shah fled before me, running from city to city, abandoning his people. He fled across deserts, across rivers, until at last he died on an island in the Caspian Sea, sick, hunted, broken. His death was quiet, my vengeance was not. But conquest was never only destruction. With each city we took, I sent artisans, scholars, scribes back to my lands. I wanted their knowledge, their craft, their science. My empire would not be only horses and arrows. It would be law, script, bridges, irrigation, trade. From the ruins of Khwarezm, I took both terror and treasure, weaving them into the fabric of my rule. Some called me monster, others called me destiny. I did not care. What mattered was that the Shah had mocked me, and now his empire was ash and smoke. His insult to my envoys was answered 100-fold. The merchants of the world would learn. Under Chingis Khan, caravans were safe if they obeyed the law, but cities that defied me would be erased so thoroughly that only the wind would remember their names. When we rode back east, the men sang. The herds were fat with loot, the wagons heavy with gold and silk, the empire swollen with new lands. I rode among them, silent, my vow still heavy in my chest. For every victory I knew there would be another enemy, another insult, another wall to burn. That was the way of the steppe, the way of the world. But I had proven something greater, that the Mongols were no longer a scattered people mocked by neighbours, no longer boys yoked in wooden kangus. We were empire breakers. And I, Temujin, son of Yesuge, once starved and humiliated, was now Chingis Khan, whose name thundered from China to the Caspian, whose shadow fell on kings, whose messengers carried both fear and law. When a man holds too much land beneath his horse's hooves, the land itself begins to bite back. I had broken Khwarezm, scattered the Shah into the sea, sent my generals as far as the Caucasus and the Russlands, where they returned with stories of frightened princes and burned villages. Yet the empire was not a pasture that could be left untended. The more it grew, the more it demanded of me. A Khan who rides only to conquer leaves his throne empty. A Khan who stays to rule leaves his warriors restless. I had to be both, rider and judge, wolf and shepherd. The yasa grew heavier in those years. What began as my word by the fire became law carried across deserts, mountains, forests. It was written down, memorized, spoken in markets, enforced by captains who once had been shepherds and slaves. Share the spoils fairly. Keep loyalty to the chain of command. Do not steal, do not lie, do not disobey without punishment. Many thought it harsh, but they learned quickly that harsh law brings stability, and stability brings plunder. My empire became not only feared, but ordered, a road where caravans could travel under the banner of Chingis without fear of bandits. That too was conquest. I still punished betrayal ruthlessly, a general who lied, a noble who hoarded, a family who defied me. Their punishment was swift, public, final. Mercy is a weapon, but so is fear, and I wielded both. Yet I also rewarded as no Khan before me had. A poor man could rise to command 1,000 if he proved worthy. Nobility was not blood, but action. This bound men to me more tightly than kinship ever had. I had turned the chaos of the steppe into order and order into empire. But the work was endless. Envoys came from every direction, some bearing gifts, others threats. I received silk from the Song, horses from Korea, gold from Khwarezm's ashes, furs from the north. Princes bowed, sultans trembled, kings sent letters they hoped would flatter me. My generals pressed outward still, Subotai testing the Rus, Jerby riding as far as the Black Sea. Each victory brought new maps, new names, new burdens. And yet, even as the empire swelled, old enemies still whispered. The Tanguts of Shishya, who had once bowed, dared to defy me again, withholding tribute, mocking my commands. Age was upon me by then, my hair streaked with grey, my bones heavy, but insults still burned as fiercely as when I was a boy yoked in a kanji. I swore to ride against them once more, to end them completely. That campaign was my last. We rode into the deserts, the mountains, battering their fortresses, burning their towns. My men were seasoned, my generals unmatched. Shishya crumbled under our hooves, though they fought stubbornly, clinging to walls, praying to their gods. Their gods did not answer. My vengeance was complete. Their dynasty was erased, their name reduced to whispers. But victory came with shadow. I fell ill during that campaign. Some say from wounds, some from sickness, some whisper from a horse's fall. I felt the weakness in my chest, the slowing of my breath. For a man who had lived his life in the saddle, nothing is more bitter than to feel the body betray the will. Still, I kept riding. A Khan does not die lying down. He dies commanding. I gave orders from my tent, my generals kneeling, my sons watching. I told them the empire must not break, must not scatter like the clans after my father's death. I had built a rope from 1,000 strands. If they let it fray, all would be lost. I spoke of succession, of unity, of the need to keep Yasa above quarrel. My sons bristled, each with his own pride, each with his own claim. I saw in their eyes the same hunger that once burned in mine. Hunger builds empires, but hunger also tears them apart. Still, I gave them my command. Obey the law, hold the empire together, punish betrayal, reward loyalty. I could not give them peace. I could only give them iron. The end came quietly. The desert wind rattled the felt of my tent, horses whickered in the night, guards paced. My breath grew shallow, my eyes heavy. I thought of Herlun, of Berta, of the boy I had been, starving, humiliated, wearing a wooden yoke. I thought of Jarmuka's betrayal, of the Merkit's raid, of the 70 boiled alive. I thought of Jungdu's walls, of Bukhara's mosque, of rivers running red at Urgench. I thought of the vow I had made as a boy to make the steppe speak my name, and I realized it had. When my eyes closed, I knew the empire would ride on without me. The wolf had become storm, and storms do not die with one man. Death came to me as it comes to all men, but I refused to let it come with weakness. In my tent, my chest heavy, I gave orders until my tongue was dry. The empire could not see me falter. If they saw their skein as broken, the rope I had tied from 1,000 clans would begin to loosen. So I told my generals, when I die, hide it. Hide it until the campaign is finished, until the Tanguts are dust, until the victory is ours. A Khan does not die in retreat, and so they obeyed. My body grew cold, even as my banners still waved in the desert wind. My generals carried out my orders as if my voice still echoed among them. My soldiers rode, unaware that their Khan was already a shadow. Shisha was crushed, their dynasty erased, their cities flattened. Only when vengeance was complete did my generals whisper the truth. The Khan is gone. What to do with my body was no small matter. I had told them, let no man know where I rest. If enemies found my grave, they would desecrate it. If allies found it, they would fight over it. Better that no one know. Better that the earth itself keep the secret. So they carried me eastward, across deserts and mountains, through forests and rivers, my coffin hidden beneath wagons, guarded by men who killed anyone who saw the procession. Villages were burned along the way to erase witnesses, rivers diverted, paths wiped clean. My funeral was a campaign of silence. Some say I was buried near Birchen Kaldun, the sacred mountain of my youth, where I once hid from enemies and swore my first vows to the eternal blue sky. Others say my grave was dug so deep that even rivers were made to cover it. Perhaps I was carried farther still, into places where no men walked. I will not tell you. The truth of my bones is less important than the truth of my name, because my name did not die. When I was young, I swore that the steppe would speak my name. Now it spoke it in 1,000 tongues. From China to Persia, from the Caspian to the Yellow Sea, men whispered Chingis Khan with fear, with awe, with curses, with prayers. I had turned scattered clans into an empire, lawless raiders into disciplined armies, laughter into silence. My sons and generals would carry the storm farther still, into Russia, into the Middle East, even toward Europe. The world that once ignored us now bent beneath our hooves. But legacy is not only conquest, it is law. The Yasa remained, binding men to justice harsher but fairer than kinship. It was my true monument, more enduring than towers, more fearsome than armies. Traders crossed my empire safely, artisans flourished, messengers carried orders across thousands of miles in days. The world became smaller under my rule, as if I had pulled the horizon closer with my own hands. And yet, I knew that even law cannot silence envy. My sons quarreled, each hungering for more, each believing himself destined. I left them power, but I could not give them peace. Peace is not the gift of conquerors. It is the dream of those who live after. Still, I do not regret. I was born with nothing. A boy in a wooden kangui, mocked, starving. I rose to command men not because of blood, but because of vow. I kept my word, and men gave me theirs. Together we burned cities, toppled dynasties, erased kingdoms. Together we carved a world that would never again laugh at Mongol weakness. I am gone, but I am not. Every rider who thunders across the steppe carries me. Every soldier who obeys the Yasa breathes me. Every king who trembles at the word Mongol feels my hand at his throat. Bones rot, but names live. My bones may be hidden beneath rivers, beneath forests, beneath sacred mountains, but my name rides forever on the wind. I was Temujin, son of Yesuge. I became Chingis Khan, and when the steppe speaks in thunder, it still speaks my name. Now get comfortable and settle in for our next story, the story of Avicenna. I was born near Bukhara, in a village called Avicenna, in the year 980 of the Christian calendar. My father was a respected man, a local administrator in the service of the Samanid dynasty, proud to be part of a culture where scholarship was valued alongside the sword. My mother gave me not wealth, but discipline. She taught me to look at the world with restless eyes, to never be satisfied with surface answers. In my earliest memories, I remember her urging me not only to listen, but to ask, to test, to compare. From the first days I spoke, curiosity consumed me. Every word I heard, I wanted to dissect. Every fact I encountered, I wanted to turn into principle. My father, seeing this hunger, invited scholars into our house. He gathered discussions in mathematics, in philosophy, in the law of Islam. I, still a child, would sit in the corner, silent, absorbing. I learned quickly to recognize the names of Aristotle and Galen, Plato and Hippocrates, as if they were relatives spoken of in whispers. By the time I was 10, I had memorized the Quran, not simply to recite it, but to interpret, to question. I would recite passages to scholars and then ask why a verse could not be understood differently, why the words of God could not carry layers beyond what was obvious. Some were amused, others rebuked me. But I felt already that truth was not a single wall to be accepted. It was a structure that must be explored from every angle, even if it unsettled those around me. My father believed in a sect close to Ismaili teachings, and he invited their missionaries to speak. They would sit, discussing cosmology, the hierarchy of intellects, the mystery of creation. I listened and absorbed, though even then I felt their answers lacked the rigor I desired. They spoke with passion, but passion is not demonstration. It was then I learned the difference between conviction and proof, and I swore to myself, I will never be satisfied until reason and experience meet. In Bukhara, the libraries were treasures greater than gold. The Samanid rulers had collected manuscripts from across Persia, India, Byzantium. When I first entered such a library, I felt my chest burn as if I had inhaled fire. There were scrolls and books covering medicine, astronomy, mathematics, logic, poetry. I longed to devour them all. I spent hours copying passages, making notes, arguing with words centuries older than me. But I was not only student of books. I questioned everything I saw. When a man bled from a wound, I asked why the blood slowed if pressed. When fever struck my neighbors, I asked why heat could consume flesh without fire. I watched animals, their motions, their instincts, and I wrote in secret. If we knew how the body works, we would know how the soul commands. Even as a boy, medicine called to me, not as magic, not as amulets and charms, but as knowledge that could be tested, repeated, improved. My teachers soon admitted I surpassed them. They taught me arithmetic. I mastered it in days. They taught me geometry. I solved theorems they had never attempted. They brought me books on logic. I debated them into silence. Some grew resentful, muttering that I was arrogant. But I knew it was not arrogance. It was hunger, a hunger no bread could satisfy, no meal could silence. At 16, I was already treating the sick. My reputation spread from village to city. Families brought their children to me when fevers consumed them. Soldiers came when wounds festered. I observed, I experimented. I remembered what Galen wrote and what Hippocrates advised, and I improved upon them. I told myself, a true physician is not the one who repeats formulas, but the one who observes nature and obeys her. Looking back, I see that my childhood ended not in play, but in questions. I was not content to memorize. I demanded to understand. That demand would carry me through libraries, palaces, prisons. It would make me beloved and hated, exalted and exiled. But as a boy in Bukhara, surrounded by books, I already felt the destiny that burned in my chest. To write knowledge that would outlive kings. To discover truths that would heal not only the body, but the soul. When I recall my youth, I do not remember play or leisure, but nights when the lamp oil ran out and I studied by moonlight, straining my eyes until they burned, unwilling to let darkness rob me of a single line. Other boys boasted of horses or of archery, but my pride was that I could wrestle with a page of Aristotle longer than any of them could sit in a saddle. My world was parchment, ink, the pulse of thought in my head that would not quiet until I had wrestled it into clarity. In Bukhara, my father could not hire the greatest teachers, but he gave me the greatest gift. Through introductions to men of learning, I absorbed from them what I could, and when they ran dry, I moved beyond them. Arithmetic came easily. I solved problems faster than my teachers could pose them. Algebra challenged me, but I relished the challenge. Geometry became not just lines and shapes, but proofs that mirrored the order of creation itself. Astronomy taught me to measure the heavens, though already I doubted the rigid spheres of Ptolemy. Logic became my constant companion. I learned the forms of syllogism, the difference between demonstration and persuasion. I debated men twice my age, and though they frowned at my boldness, they could not deny the sharpness of my tongue. I realized early that truth was not owned by elders. It belonged to whoever could prove it. And I swore I would prove it again and again, no matter how many frowns I gathered. Medicine entered my life as necessity, not theory. Plagues and fevers did not wait for scholars to finish their commentaries. People sickened, people died, and the physicians of Bukhara often offered charms, prayers, recitations more than remedies. I read Galen and Hippocrates, yes, but more importantly, I observed. I asked, why does pressure stop bleeding? Why does a fever break with sweat? Why does a poultice of certain herbs soothe when others inflame? I tested, I noted, I remembered. Each patient was a page, and each illness a text to be read carefully. By 16, my reputation had begun to spread. At first villagers came, uncertain, bringing children with coughs, men with wounds that stank of rot. I treated them as best I could, not with incantations, but with herbs, with careful observation, with reason. Word grew. Soon wealthier families sent for me. Soldiers limped into my presence, asking not for charms, but for knowledge. One night I was summoned to the palace of the Samanid ruler, Nu ibn Mansur, who lay gravely ill. The court physicians had failed him, their remedies worse than the disease. I examined him carefully, balancing what I had read with what I saw. I prescribed simple measures, diet, regulation, herbs in precise proportion. Within days he recovered. The palace resounded with my name, and in gratitude he granted me access to the royal library, a treasure vaster than any caravan. That library was my true youth. Imagine halls lined with manuscripts from every land, Greek texts in translation, Indian treatises, works of Persians long forgotten, volumes of medicine, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy. To me it was paradise. I read without rest, sometimes until dawn, until my head throbbed and my body trembled. I copied, I compared, I cross-referenced. Knowledge became my food. I fed myself on logic, on anatomy, on metaphysics. It was there I first encountered Aristotle in full. His words were dense, his reasoning sharp as a blade. I felt him wrestle with me across centuries. I disagreed, I argued, I sometimes lost. But from him I learned the discipline of reason, the need for demonstration, the refusal to accept what cannot be proven. Plato I found lofty, Galen practical, Hippocrates humane. But Aristotle became the anvil on which I hammered my own thought. My teachers could no longer keep pace. They listened as I explained to them passages they had not understood. They nodded as I offered cures they had not imagined. Some resented me, others marveled. But I understood then that youth was not an obstacle. It was fuel. While others tired, I burned. While others hesitated, I leapt. I was not content to repeat. I demanded to create. And yet, even in my hunger, I felt isolation. Knowledge made me both admired and envied. Friends turned distant, teachers suspicious. My father, though proud, sometimes urged caution. Wisdom is heavy, my son. Do not carry it so openly that men wish to cut your back. But I could not obey. Knowledge burned in me like fever, and I knew only one cure: to learn more, to test more, to see deeper. It was in those years I began to believe that medicine and philosophy were not separate. To heal the body, one must understand nature. To understand nature, one must know logic. To know logic, one must grasp the soul. All knowledge was one, a tree with many branches, and I vowed that one day I would write a book that showed this unity, a book so complete that no physician could practice without it, no philosopher could ignore it. I was still only a youth, but I already felt older than the men who doubted me. Knowledge does that. It steals childhood quickly. By the time I was 20, I was no longer Ibn Sina, the boy of Avicenna. I was Avicenna, physician, philosopher, restless seeker, already carrying the outlines of works that would outlast empires. When I began to call myself physician, I knew the danger of arrogance. Many before me had claimed mastery, yet when fever swept their homes, their learning dissolved into panic and charms. I swore I would not be like them. I would treat medicine as a science, not sorcery, as demonstration, not recital. I learned first that the body obeys laws like the stars and the earth. If you observe carefully, you see that illness has patterns, and those patterns can be described. A cough that worsens after eating fatty food is not the same as a cough that strikes at night. A fever that rises with a chill differs from one that rises with sweat. I made notes on each, compared them, tested remedies, and adjusted. Slowly my practice became less superstition, more experiment. I treated wounds from the battlefield. Soldiers came with arrows lodged deep, with cuts turning green, with bones broken. Others before me might have prayed over them. I cleaned the wounds, bound them, sometimes cut away dead flesh to save the living. Many survived who otherwise would have been lost. From them I learned courage, not only theirs but mine, to cut boldly when delay meant death. I studied anatomy, though the laws of my faith and my culture forbade dissection of the dead. So I observed animals, compared them with the living human body, and used my reason to bridge the gaps. I learned that the pulse was not simply a beat of life, but a language of illness. Each variation told me of imbalance in the humours, of the state of heart and liver, of heat and cold. I carried 2 fingers like instruments sharper than knives. But I was not bound only by the Greeks. Galen and Hippocrates had laid stones, but I walked farther. They taught of humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and I acknowledged their framework. But I added, disease is not only imbalance, but external cause. Air, water, contagion. If one man sickens and then another who drinks from the same well, it is not coincidence. Something travels, unseen, carrying illness. I wrote this, though others scoffed. Centuries later, they will call it infection. To me, it was simply reason. I prescribed diet above drugs when possible. Food is the constant medicine. Herbs are the sudden ones. A man with fever should be cooled, not filled with endless potions. A man with stomach pain should eat light, not gorge. Rest, water, balance. These were as important as any mixture. Still, I learnt herbs well. The cooling of cucumber, the heat of garlic, the calm of opium when used with care. I catalogued them, noted their effects, always refining. Women came to me too, often ignored by other physicians. I treated childbirth, fevers of the womb, pains of the monthly cycle. I wrote that female bodies deserved the same study as male, that their illnesses were not curses, but natural conditions. It shocked some, but I did not care. Truth cares little for scandal. My fame spread, not because I promised miracles, but because I delivered survival. In Bukhara, in Gurganj, in Rai, in Hamadan, rulers summoned me, merchants hired me, peasants begged me. I treated each with the same seriousness, for illness does not respect status. I began to write my findings, collecting them into notes that would grow into my greatest work, Al-Qanun fi al-Tib, the Canon of Medicine. In that work, I sought not only to describe diseases and cures, but to build a system. Medicine is not a pile of remedies, it is a science with structure. So I divided it: general principles of health, simple drugs, complex drugs, diseases by organ, diseases by the whole body, each part ordered, explained, supported by observation. I wanted a book that any physician in any land could use as guide, a book that would not die with me but carry my hand into centuries. Even as I wrote, I practiced. A ruler's son once collapsed with a mysterious illness. Physicians said demons. I said, bring me his pulse. I asked questions, spoke gently, and saw his face flush when a young maid entered. His illness was not of body, but of love. I told his father, give him the girl, and he will recover. He did, and the boy's pulse steadied within hours. Sometimes the soul weighs heavier than the body. Other times, the body betrays itself. I diagnosed diabetes not by name, but by observing the ants gathered around a patient's urine. I noted that tuberculosis passed between people who lived close. I warned that contaminated water carried disease. My words spread, copied, translated. Some believed, others doubted. But I knew I was laying foundations that would last longer than palaces. I became physician to princes, but I never ceased to be student. Every case was a page, every patient a book. And in each I saw the same truth. Knowledge without practice is nothing, and practice without knowledge is blind. My task was to join them, to make of medicine both science and art. By my 30s, I had treated rulers and paupers, written more than most read, and begun the canon that would outlive me by 1,000 years. Yet I still felt I was only beginning. Knowledge is an ocean, and I had only learned to swim. If medicine taught me how the body works, philosophy taught me how everything else might. I never separated the two, for the body without the soul is a corpse, and philosophy without practice is an empty dream. From the moment I read Aristotle, I felt a blade pressing into my mind, sharp, relentless, forcing me to distinguish, to define, to prove. Others treated philosophy as poetry. I treated it as anatomy of the unseen. I read Aristotle's metaphysics, his physics, his organon, each line dense with logic. He spoke of substance, cause, motion, potentiality, and actuality. I wrestled with his categories until my nights blurred with diagrams, syllogisms, arguments. But I also saw where he faltered. His cosmos was a series of spheres turning eternally, the heavens unmoved, the earth at center. Yet already I sensed this was incomplete. The world was not a rigid cage of spheres. It was movement, change, contingency. Still, Aristotle gave me discipline, the demand that thought must follow demonstration. Without him, philosophy would have dissolved into mysticism. With him, it gained spine. I said often, Aristotle is correct in most things, but not all. Even the greatest mind must be refined by others. From Aristotle, I turned to Plotinus, to the Neoplatonists, who spoke of the One, the emanation of intellect and soul. Their words carried beauty, but too often they floated above ground. I tried to pull them down. Yes, there is one, the necessary existent, the foundation of all being. But from this necessary being, flow causes, intelligences, spheres, not as myth, but as logical consequence. The universe is a chain, each link dependent, but all anchored in necessity. This thought became central to me. Everything that exists is either necessary in itself or necessary through another. Only God, the necessary existent, exists by his own nature. All else exists because of him. Thus, philosophy and faith are not enemies but companions. Where revelation speaks of God, philosophy demonstrates why such a being must exist. Where revelation speaks of order, philosophy shows the structure. The soul I treated as carefully as the body. What is the soul? It is not flesh, not blood, not organ. It is form, intellect, substance distinct from matter. The vegetative soul governs growth, digestion. The animal soul governs movement, sensation. The rational soul alone perceives universals, truth beyond the senses. The rational soul, I wrote, is immaterial, eternal, surviving the death of the body. In this, I reconciled faith with philosophy. Yes, man dies, but the soul endures, judged, rewarded, not by superstition, but by necessity of its nature. I studied logic deeply because logic is the physician of thought. Just as the doctor distinguishes fever from chill, the logician distinguishes valid from invalid reasoning. I memorized forms, syllogism, induction, analogy. I tested arguments as I tested remedies. If a man came to me with fever, I would observe, compare, conclude. If a philosopher came with a claim, I would dissect his reasoning the same way. Many disliked my sharpness, accusing me of arrogance. But truth does not bend to politeness. Some accused me of undermining faith. They said, Ibn Sina trusts reason too much. He dissects revelation as if it were a patient. I answered, revelation is true, but truth does not fear inquiry. If philosophy and faith seem to conflict, then one has been misunderstood. And if philosophers contradict revelation, it is not faith that suffers, but the philosopher who erred. For me, both paths must meet. It was in these years I began to write works beyond medicine, commentaries on Aristotle, treatises on metaphysics, essays on the soul, on being, on knowledge. I wrote that knowledge begins with sense but rises to intellect, where universals are abstracted. I argued that prophecy is the perfection of imagination, joined with intellect, allowing truths to be received and communicated symbolically. Thus, prophets are not magicians, but men whose souls are polished mirrors reflecting divine truth. I wrote 2 of ethics. Happiness is the perfection of the soul, achieved by knowledge of truth and by virtue. Pleasure without virtue is fleeting. Knowledge without practice is empty. The physician must heal bodies, but the philosopher must heal souls. And in both, I sought to serve. Medicine for pain, philosophy for ignorance. My nights blurred with ink. I wrote until dawn, then lectured, then practiced medicine, then returned to write again. I felt myself building a structure, stone by stone, logic by logic. Medicine was one wing, philosophy the other. Together they lifted me higher than either could alone. Looking back, I know many cursed me. Theologians called me dangerous, too bold, too rational. Others called me heretic. Yet centuries later, even they would study my works, because reason, once sharpened, does not grow dull again. My words travelled to Andalus, to Christendom, to scholars who would call me Avicenna. They debated me, corrected me, but they could not ignore me. That is enough for any philosopher, to be part of the eternal conversation. But in my own time, I was only Ibn Sina, restless, burning, never satisfied. Medicine healed my patients, philosophy healed me. Without it, I would have been only a physician. With it, I became a seeker of truth itself. When I look back on my life, I know that no single deed, no patient cured, no argument delivered in debate will last as long as the book I wrote in the long hours of solitude. Al-Qanun fi al-Tib, the canon of medicine. Even while I lived, I sensed it would outlive me. I did not intend it as a monument, but as a tool, a map, a library compressed into one hand. Yet it became my monument nonetheless. The idea was simple. Medicine scattered across centuries and continents needed order. Galen had written much. Hippocrates before him. Indian physicians had left treasures. Persians had preserved knowledge. Arabs had added discoveries. But the knowledge was like a caravan without discipline, wandering, repeating, contradicting. I wanted to make of it an army, organized, commanded, clear in rank. So I began to write. I divided the book into 5 volumes. The first was General Principles, the foundations of health, disease, the elements, temperaments, humours. I explained that health is equilibrium, disease is imbalance, and that every treatment is an attempt to restore harmony. I wrote of anatomy, not as hidden speculation, but as a system. Bones, muscles, vessels, organs, each with purpose, each obeying law. I wrote of causes, internal, external, psychological. I insisted that mind and body cannot be separated, that melancholy of spirit can harm the flesh, and corruption of flesh can darken the soul. The second volume described simple drugs, hundreds of them, each listed, each tested, each classified by effect, hot, cold, dry, moist, but also by observation. I wrote not only what Galen claimed, but what I myself had seen, that opium calms pain, but in excess poisons, that garlic warms the stomach, but inflames the eye, that rose oil soothes, that vinegar cleanses. I wanted the physician not to rely on memory alone, but to have at hand a compendium precise and orderly. The third and fourth volumes address diseases, the third by organ, head to toe, brain, eyes, ears, lungs, heart, stomach, liver, kidneys, skin. For each, I described symptoms, causes, treatments. I taught how to read the pulse, how to interpret urine, how to distinguish diseases that mimic one another. The fourth dealt with diseases of the whole body, fevers, poisons, infections, swellings. Here I made my most daring statements, that disease can spread from person to person, that water and air can carry corruption. Many doubted, but I wrote what observation forced me to believe. The fifth volume was complex drugs, compound remedies mixed from simples. Here I described formulas, proportions, methods of preparation. I did not encourage blind faith in recipes. I reminded the physician, always observe, always adjust, always place reason above tradition. A medicine that heals one man may harm another. The art is judgment. I did not write quickly. The canon grew as I grew, revised, expanded, refined. At times I carried notes with me from city to city, from court to exile, never ceasing to polish. It became more than a book. It was my life set into order. When I practiced, I tested what I had written. A patient with fever, I compared his pulse to my descriptions, his urine to my notes, his appetite to my theories. When I was right, I corrected others. When I was wrong, I corrected myself. Slowly, the canon became not only record, but authority. Physicians copied it, students memorized it. In Bukhara, in Hamadan, in Rai, in Isfahan, I heard my own words repeated to me as if they had always been. What I wanted most was clarity. Too many books drowned readers in endless detail, contradictions, scattered anecdotes. I gave order. I cut away what was useless, kept what was true, added what I discovered. When men opened my book, they found a map through the chaos of disease. That was my pride. Not novelty for its own sake, but system, discipline, coherence. I did not know then how far it would travel. Translations into Latin, into Hebrew, into languages I never heard. Scholars in Andalus, in Paris, in Bologna, in Padua studied it, taught from it, argued with it. For centuries they called me Princeps Medicorum, the Prince of Physicians. My canon stood beside Galen as equal, sometimes above him. Even when Europe's medicine changed, when new discoveries came, they still bowed to my structure, my method. The book I wrote to serve my time became the book that served centuries. And yet I remind myself, I was not infallible. I erred, as all men do. Some of my classifications were wrong, some of my remedies imperfect. But the essence was this, that medicine is rational, that it must be based on observation, experience, logic. That was my true gift. The rest could be corrected. The method would endure. When I hear scholars call me immortal, I smile. It was not immortality I sought. It was clarity, order, reason. But perhaps clarity itself is immortal. A physician cannot live only with books. The world insists on dragging him into its noise. My reputation spread far beyond Bichara, and with reputation came summons. Princes and governors wanted not only my cures but also my counsel, for they believed that a man who could heal the body might also heal the state. They were half right and half terribly mistaken. I served in courts that glittered with wealth but stank of intrigue. In Ray, I ministered to rulers whose stomachs were heavier than their minds. In Hamadan, I treated the Buyid Emir Shams al-Dawla, a man whose moods were as unpredictable as his fevers. When he was ill, he clutched me as saviour. When he was well, he forgot me as if I were a servant. Such is the gratitude of princes. Yet I stayed, because a physician's oath does not permit him to abandon even a fool. I prescribed, I soothed, I saved. At times my remedies succeeded, at times they failed, for no man can command fate. But each success bound me deeper into politics. Soon I was not only physician but vizier, drawn into councils, asked to weigh in on law, finance, war. I accepted, though with caution, because I believed the knowledge must not be hoarded in ivory towers. And yet, the higher you climb, the sharper the knives. Jealous courtiers whispered against me. Scholars envious of my fame accused me of heresy, of arrogance, of meddling in affairs too lofty for a physician. Twice I was imprisoned, once in Hamadan, once later when factions turned. In the cell I had nothing but straw and scraps of parchment, yet even there I wrote. I composed treatises by lamplight, scratching words onto margins, reciting passages aloud so I would not lose them. Chains can bind hands, but not thought. I escaped more than once, disguised in dark robes, slipping past guards at night, carrying nothing but manuscripts under my cloak. I wandered, sometimes alone, sometimes with students who refused to abandon me. We moved from city to city, Gurganj, Isfahan, Qazvin, wherever rulers would host us, wherever libraries would open. Some welcomed me with honor, others with suspicion. But always I found patience, always I found pens. My medicine brought me safety when politics could not. I remember once during battle near Hamadan when soldiers clashed outside the walls and the city shook with fear. Instead of fleeing, I rode out with the emir, tending wounded on the field. I dressed cuts, set bones, calmed the dying. Blood spattered my robe, dust choked my lungs. Yet I wrote notes in my mind, even as arrows fell. Notes about shock, about bleeding, about the limits of endurance. Knowledge must be gathered even among corpses. At times I grew weary, wandering, exile, betrayal, prison. These are heavy burdens for any man. Yet each time I asked myself, what else could I do? To stop writing would be to kill my own soul. To stop practicing would be to betray my oath. So I endured, and in endurance I grew harder, like iron hammered again and again. In Isfahan I finally found respite under Allah al-Dawla, a ruler wise enough to value me. There I completed many of my works, taught students, gathered manuscripts. I felt, for a moment, that I had a home. The court was still filled with intrigue, but I had learned by then how to walk among daggers without being cut too deeply. My remedies healed the prince, my counsel guided his campaigns, and my books multiplied. Still, I knew that politics devours even the strongest. I watched empires rise and fall in the span of my life. Rulers poisoned, generals betrayed, cities burned. Knowledge alone endures. That was my comfort, that while palaces crumble, my canon and my philosophy would ride farther than any army, endure longer than any dynasty. so I lived half as physician, half as wanderer, half as vizier, half as prisoner. And yet, through it all, I remained wholly Ibn Sina, restless, unbroken, driven. My life was a storm, but my pen was steady. When I grew older and the dust of wandering settled for a time, I turned more and more to philosophy, not because I abandoned medicine, but because I believed they were twins, born from the same mother. Reason. A physician without philosophy is a blind craftsman. A philosopher without medicine is a dreamer who never touched flesh. I wished to be neither blind nor dreamer. I wished to be whole. Logic had been my earliest tool, and it remained my foundation. I wrote treatises expanding Aristotle's organon, clarifying, correcting, reordering. To me, logic was not merely an exercise in games. It was the grammar of thought itself, the physician of the intellect. Just as I had classified drugs, I classified arguments, valid, invalid, persuasive, demonstrative. I explained how definitions must be exact, how categories must be consistent, how premises must be arranged like bones in a skeleton. If the skeleton is crooked, the body collapses. If the syllogism is flawed, the conclusion dies. But beyond logic lay metaphysics, the highest of sciences. Here I wrestled with Aristotle most fiercely, and with the Neoplatonists who tried to cloak his thought in mysticism. I stripped away what I saw as confusion and built my own system. At the heart of it was the necessary existent, God, whose existence is not caused by anything else, who is pure being itself. From him emanate intellects, spheres, and finally the world of matter. This was not poetry, it was demonstration. Everything that exists is either necessary in itself or necessary through another. Only God is necessary in himself. Thus, the chain of existence is explained. I wrote of the soul in detail. I divided it into the vegetative soul, which governs growth and reproduction, the animal soul, which governs movement and sensation, and the rational soul, which alone perceives universals, abstracts from particulars, seeks truth. The rational soul is immaterial, incorruptible, surviving the body. In this I found harmony with faith. Immortality of the soul is not only revelation, it is reason. Yet I also ventured where some theologians feared. I asked, how does God know particulars? I answered, he knows them not as we know them, by detail, but by knowing the universal laws from which they flow. This troubled some, who thought I diminished divine knowledge, but I insisted, to know the universal is higher than to know the particular. God's knowledge is not less, but infinitely more. For these words, some called me heretic, but centuries later, even my critics would study me, for my arguments were carved too deeply to be ignored. In epistemology, I argued that knowledge begins in sense perception, the eye, the ear, the skin, but rises through imagination to intellect, where universals are abstracted. Yet above intellect, there is the active intellect, eternal, which illuminates the human mind like the sun illuminates the eye. Without this illumination, we could not know universals. This was my way of explaining prophecy. The prophet is one whose soul is perfectly polished, receiving truths from the active intellect and expressing them through imagination in visions, parables, laws. Thus, prophecy is not magic, but the perfection of human faculties. I also wrote of being and essence. Essence answers the question, what is it? Being answers the question, is it? Essence can exist in the mind without being in reality. A unicorn has essence, but not being. God alone is essence identical with being. From this distinction flowed much of my metaphysics, later debated by Latins as Avicenna's essence and existence. They argued, they corrected, they borrowed, but they never escaped my terms. My works grew vast. Kitab al-Shifa, the Book of Healing, a philosophical encyclopedia, Al-Najat, the Book of Deliverance, a summary, al-isharat wal-tanbihat, pointers and reminders, where I spoke more cryptically, as if to students ready for the subtler truths. In each I tried to weave medicine, logic, metaphysics, ethics into one tapestry. For me, knowledge was one. To divide it was to mutilate it. Ethics I treated as medicine of the soul. Just as imbalance of humours causes bodily disease, imbalance of desires causes moral disease. The cure is moderation, the regimen of virtue. Happiness, I wrote, is the perfection of the soul through knowledge of truth and practice of virtue. Wealth, power, pleasure, these are fleeting. Knowledge and virtue endure. I practiced little of asceticism, for I believed the world is not evil in itself. It is disorder that is evil. Order, harmony, balance. That is good. I remember nights in Isfahan, sitting in lamplight, dictating page after page, my students scribbling furiously. My body grew weaker, but my pen grew stronger. I felt I was not writing for my time, but for centuries unborn. I imagined readers in lands I would never see, men whose tongues I would not understand, wrestling with my words as I had wrestled with Aristotle. That thought gave me strength, to be part of an eternal conversation. Is this not the true immortality? Still, I knew I would be misunderstood. Already theologians whispered against me. Already envious scholars mocked me. I accepted it. Truth is never embraced by all. What matters is that some will carry it forward, refine it, surpass it. If I am the stone in the foundation, let others be the tower. Looking back, I see that medicine gave me fame, but philosophy gave me peace. When I cured a prince, he lived a few years more. When I wrote a principle, it lived 1,000 years more. Flesh rots, thought endures. That is why, even as my body weakened, my mind burned ever brighter. My final years were not spent in peace, but in weariness. For my body betrayed me, even while my mind refused to rest. I had healed thousands, written for generations unborn, advised rulers and outlasted prisons. But I could not heal myself. The years of riding, of battles, of nights without sleep, of study by lamp until my eyes blurred, they carved into my flesh like hidden knives. Illness began quietly, as it always does. At first it was fatigue, a heaviness in my limbs, a cough that would not leave, a stomach that turned against food. I diagnosed myself as any physician would. I prescribed diet, moderation, herbs. For a time I improved, but I knew that death was patient, and death had already begun its slow approach. Still, I refused to surrender. I dictated pages even when fever burned in me. My students begged me to rest, to let others carry on. But I told them, the pen is lighter than the sword, but it must be lifted until the last breath. If my body crumbles, my words must not. So I wrote, lying on cushions, too weak to rise, still describing anatomy, still explaining metaphysics, still revising the canon. My hand trembled, but my voice was steady. In Hamadan, I continued to serve as physician to the emir, though my own health faltered. It was an irony too sharp to miss. The physician who could heal others could not heal himself. Yet I accepted it. Medicine is not immortality. It is reprieve, an extension, a balance. I had lived more than 50 years. In my time, that was a long life. Many rulers I had served were already dust. My words outlived them, and that was enough. I grew reckless at times, pushing myself with strong drugs, stimulants, tonics, trying to force my body to keep pace with my mind. It worked for days, then failed, leaving me weaker still. My students watched me with sorrow, but I laughed. If I die experimenting on myself, I told them, I will still die as a physician. I travelled once more to Isfahan, seeking quiet, but even there, politics followed. Wars shook the land, armies marched, cities burned. Yet I stayed at my writing desk, as if the noise of war were only distant thunder. The true battle was in ink, the war to preserve knowledge from chaos. When the end grew close, I felt it in my bones. Pain gripped me, fever consumed me. I knew then that I could not outwit death. I turned my thoughts inward. I reviewed my life as if it were a book I had written. Each chapter a city, each page a patient, each margin a debate. What had I accomplished? I had written the canon. I had composed works of philosophy, of logic, of ethics. I had healed countless men and women. I had taught students who would carry my words farther than I could walk. Was that enough? Perhaps. No man can do more than his span allows. I asked myself, was I proud? Yes, but pride tempered with humility. For every discovery I made, there were truths I could not reach. I had explained much of the body, but not all. I had probed deep into metaphysics, but mysteries remained. Yet that is the destiny of knowledge. No man completes it. Each only adds a stone. I had laid many stones, others would build the tower. As death drew near, I confessed my sins. For even a philosopher is a man, with failings, with errors. I gave away wealth, freed slaves, sought forgiveness. I did not wish to meet God burdened. I had spoken often of the necessary existent. Now I prepared to face him, not with argument, but with silence. In my last days, I still taught. Students sat by my bed, reading passages aloud, asking questions. I answered as best I could, though my breath was thin. I told them, do not worship my words. Test them, correct them, carry them forward. That was my legacy, not dogma, but method. One night, as the fever peaked, I felt clarity sharper than any syllogism. The body is vessel, fragile, temporary. The soul is form, enduring. I would shed the vessel, but the form would endure. My writings were only shadows of that form, but perhaps enough to guide others. I closed my eyes with that thought, calm, unafraid. I died in Hamadan in 1037, at the age of 57. No banners, no armies, no trumpets. Only a scholar, a physician, a weary man lying in bed, surrounded by students and books. My grave was dug there, modest, unadorned. But my true grave is my works, and my true resurrection is each time a physician opens the canon, each time a philosopher reads my pages, each time a seeker of truth repeats my words. Death was not defeat, it was punctuation. My sentence had ended, but the paragraph of knowledge continued. When I closed my eyes in Hamadan, I thought my story had ended. But a man's death is only the end of his body. His words, if they are true, walk further than his feet ever could. Mine did. Even as my bones settled into the earth, my books travelled, carried by caravans, copied by scribes, read aloud in mosques, madrasas, universities, translated into tongues I never heard. My legacy was not my grave, but my pages. In medicine, my canon became the physician's constant companion. For centuries in the East, no student could call himself doctor until he had memorized its 5 volumes. In Persia, in Egypt, in Andalus, in Damascus, in Baghdad, my book was lectured line by line. Students recited my classifications of diseases, my lists of simples and compounds, my warnings about water and contagion. They carried my words to their patients, and through their hands I healed long after my own hands were dust. In time, Latin translators rendered the canon into their tongue. Gerardo of Cremona in Toledo laboured to bring it into Europe, and suddenly physicians in Paris, Padua, Montpellier, Bologna read Ibn Sina as Avicenna. They placed me beside Galen and Hippocrates, and often above them. In Europe, for nearly 600 years, the canon was the textbook of medicine. When their universities rose, my words were their foundation. When their physicians debated, they quoted me. In every lecture hall, my name echoed. I was called Princeps Medicorum, the Prince of Physicians. My book was printed in the first century of the press, again and again, because demand never ceased. Even as new discoveries came, Vesalius dissecting, Harvey tracing the circulation of blood, they still built upon the order I had given. Some corrected me, some surpassed me, but none could ignore me. For centuries, if a man in Europe learned medicine, he learned it through me. But my legacy was not only medicine. My philosophy too wandered far. My writings on logic, on metaphysics, on the soul travelled into the Latin West, into the schools of Paris. Thomas Aquinas wrestled with me, quoting me, correcting me, yet always taking me seriously. The distinction I drew between essence and existence became central in their debates. They named me not as Ibn Sina, but as Avicenna, an authority even in lands that had never heard of Bukhara. In the East, my words were debated by Al-Ghazali, who accused me of straying too far into philosophy. He condemned me for some doctrines, yet even in condemning, he spread my thought. Later, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, would argue against me, defending Aristotle more strictly, but their debates ensured that my voice was never silent. To be refuted is still to be remembered. I became a bridge between Greece and Islam, between Islam and Europe, between medicine and philosophy. I did not plan it. I only sought truth. But truth walks where it will, and my words carried it. Even centuries later, when new sciences arose, when men spoke of germs and cells, when telescopes pierced the heavens and microscopes revealed hidden life, they still whispered my name. Not because I was right in every detail, I was not, but because I had shown how to seek with reason, with observation, with order. That method is eternal. I think often in memory of the boy I was, tempted by books in the Samanid library, staying awake by lamp to wrestle with Aristotle, experimenting with herbs, asking questions no one wanted asked. That boy would be astonished to know that his words would reach Paris, London, Rome, but he would not be astonished that knowledge outlived flesh. He already knew that was the only immortality worth seeking. My tomb in Hamadan became a place of pilgrimage. Scholars and physicians visited, paying respect not to my bones, but to my words. They came from Iran, from Turkey, from India, from Europe, to stand where my body lay. But my true resting place was in their minds, in their debates, in their practices. Some call me philosopher, some physician, some polymath. I call myself a servant of truth. My body healed the sick of my time. My words healed ignorance across centuries. That is enough. If I leave you with one thought, it is this: knowledge is one. Medicine, philosophy, logic, ethics, all are branches of the same tree. To divide them is to cripple the tree. To unite them is to let it bear fruit for generations. That was my life's work, and that is my legacy. Empires have fallen since I died. Dynasties have burned, palaces crumbled. But still the canon is opened, still my words are recited, still my ideas are debated. That is the true victory. Not to conquer land, but to conquer time. I was Ibn Sina, called Avicenna, son of a small village near Bukhara, restless seeker, physician, philosopher. My flesh is gone, but my voice remains. And each time a physician cures by reason, each time a philosopher proves by logic, each time a student refuses to accept without demonstration, I live again.